This is the Comics Alternative Interviews, a conversation with Jason Lutes. Greetings and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews. I'm Derek, and today I'm happy to be talking with Jason Lutes. His complete Berlin series was recently released in one hefty volume from Drawn Quarterly, and I talk with Jason about this 20-plus years-long project and how it has come to define much of his career. But before we get to that conversation, I want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts can be anywhere from 20 to 35% off of the cover price, and every single month you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off the cover price, sometimes 50% off cover, but every now and again you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that. And since today I'm talking with Jason Lutes, it's only appropriate to point out that if you go to DCB Service right now, you can get his Berlin, the complete edition, for 30% off of the cover price. That's right, for this voluminous text, you pay only $34.97. And you can also find his earlier work, Jar of Fools, for 30% off cover price as well. You pay only $11.87. All of this just goes to show that you can't beat the prices at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com right now for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you. Jason Lutes began his Berlin series in the spring of 1996 with plans to publish his ambitious project over a 24-issue run. Over the years, he pared down the number of issues to 22, and the last of those was released in March of this year. Earlier this month, Drawn Quarterly released a complete single-volume edition of Berlin, clocking in at over 550 pages, as well as a third volume of the series, City of Light, for those who had already gotten the previous two collections, City of Stones and City of Smoke, and didn't want to get the completed series in just one volume. Berlin is a massive narrative with an ensemble cast. It takes place in that volatile city during the last days of the Weimar Republic, 1928 through 1933, when Germany was struggling with its economy and war reparations, and a variety of political factions, in particular the Communist Party and the National Socialist Workers Party, were vying for power. Lutes' story primarily focuses on the lives of Kurt Severing, a world-weary journalist, and Marthe Müller, an uncertain art student moving to Berlin and longing to define herself in this newly adopted city. But there are a variety of other characters as well, and Lutes even peppers his fictional cast with several historically based figures, including the jailed journalist Carl von Ossietzky, Joseph Goebbels, Josephine Baker, and, yes, Adolf Hitler himself. The result is a massive narrative that not only captures the Weimar culture at the time, but also explores individual desires and unpredictable relationships in the midst of political and economic upheaval. In my interview with him, I talk with Jason about the origins of the series, the amount of research that went into the project, how the city of Berlin became a point of inspiration, and the various challenges he faced maintaining such an ongoing series for over 20 years. This is definitely an interview that I've been looking forward to, and I want to share with you right now my conversation with Jason Lutes. I'm really happy to have on the Comics Alternative Jason Lutes. His complete run of Berlin, published as one volume, came out earlier this month from Drawn and Quarterly. Jason, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Derek. Thanks for having me.
And I should mention that I had the pleasure of meeting you in person last weekend at Small Press Expo. You were doing a variety of signings, and so I had you sign a copy of The Complete Berlin for a co-host of mine, Pascal. And I think there was a possibility of talking with you at SPX, but I think that it's better that we waited until afterwards in a more relaxed atmosphere. So it was nice meeting you and nice to talk with you for the podcast.
Yeah, it was great to meet you too. And I agree. It would have been pretty noisy and crazy to try to have an interview there on site.
That's right. Okay, so my first question, and this is probably something that you have been asked multiple times, so excuse me if this sounds like a canned question, but 22 issues over 20 years, how does it feel to completely, finally wrap up your Berlin series?
It feels great. My original plan had been to finish by the time I turned 40. And I actually finished the week before my 50th birthday. And also that earlier that year, I got married to the woman with whom I've had 2 kids for a long time. We finally got married. So 2017 was a really big year in a lot of ways.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. Drawing the last page of that book, and sort of sending it off to the publisher was like a great weight lifted, like for the past 22 years of my life, anytime there was a kind of a resting period, like when maybe I had some free time, there was always that pressure to like be working on the book. Because I only ever did it, in my spare time, because I had to have day jobs to pay the bills and whatnot. So it was to not have that in my mind anymore was a really, really great feeling, which still persists. I still I have lots of other projects in the works and whatnot, but nothing that had the kind of it wasn't really an oppressive weight, but it was a presence that I'm happy to have moved into the next stage of my relationship with that project.
So there are no regrets or perhaps sentimental longings for the time that you were working on Berlin? You're just glad to have it done?
Yeah, no, none of those things. I try not to have regrets in general in my life. And I definitely don't. It's funny, with my previous book, a similar thing happened where when I finished it, drew the last page and sent it off to get printed. Like when I it felt completely done to me. This is Jar of Fools was my previous graphic novel. And I don't wonder about what happens to the characters. Like I guess everything at that point feels like it's in the hands of the reader, right? Like the unwritten future of the characters in these stories are not mine anymore once I draw the last page. And I am certainly fond of a lot of the characters, but I don't. There's no sentimental aspect to it.
So, in no way whatsoever can we expect you in any way to return to Kurt or Marthe or any of the other figures that compose Berlin.
Unless I'm drawing a sketch of them in your copy of the book. Yeah, no, there's no sequel. There's no, I'm moving on to the next thing for sure.
And honestly, that's refreshing to hear. I think, especially in the medium of comics, the whole idea of sequels seems to be, I don't know, I guess what a lot of people think of as a rich vein to tap into on a fairly regular basis. I mean, we see this especially in the mainstream, but even outside of the mainstream, I think, we keep seeing returns. And I don't know, after a while, I think, okay, let it go. Even if readers think that it would be great to return to a particular figure or setting or storyline, no, it had its day. Let it shine on its own.
Yeah, I think that like characters especially in comics, have that kind of branded quality to them, or can, like if somebody, oftentimes an artist will be identified with a particular character or a particular kind of story. And there's, if it becomes popular, then clearly it can be lucrative to keep turning out work involving that character or setting or whatever. But I'm someone who I've never really had the desire to create something that has kind of an indefinite life. Everything I've ever done, it's taken me a long time to do some of them, but they've always been conceived as finite projects. So the idea of like a sort of ongoing serial that has no particular end, or characters that I would return to on a regular basis, which is very common in comics, is not something that's really interested me.
Mm. So when you started this project, and I think the first issue of Berlin was released in spring of 1996, is that correct?
I think so, yeah. Okay.
When you started this, I think you originally had an idea, I read somewhere, of 24 issues.
Yeah.
So in what ways, in addition to, I guess, the number of issues, did the project, did your storyline, did your, plans for characters and your handling of both fictional and historical events change over the past 20-some years?
That's a great question. When I started the story, I think the basic feeling was, I did 2 years of research before I started drawing, and just tried to immerse myself in Berlin in the 20s and 30s. And I had these two characters that I came up with, a young art student and a kind of older, more seasoned journalist, one from outside the city and one who's spent a lot of time in the city. And I saw them as these kind of, almost like, not really puppets, but like these little, it's funny I use the word little. So I saw the city as a kind of stage onto which I could place these characters and then allow them to explore that environment and have a relationship with each other and then encounter other people along the way. So all along, it's been a very exploratory, highly improvisational approach to storytelling that I would sort of imagine the environment as kind of thoroughly as possible and then place these characters within the environment and then, pay attention to them and sort of ask myself, what would this person do in that situation, and allow the story to evolve organically from that kind of the interactions or reactions to the things around them and the people that they ran into. So the way it changed overall was that when I started the story, I knew some kind of dramatic historical events which would impact them, like the May Day demonstrations of 1929 or the elections of 1930, which were momentous in Germany. I had those things as kind of milestones that I would try to hit, but then what happened to the characters between those things was completely improvised, and I didn't know what was going to happen to them. So the thing that really changed as I wrote the story over many years was I got to know them better. More characters kind of appeared on the scene, and before too long I had a pretty wide cast and with a number of different little stories kind of unfolding, and none of that was anything I could have predicted when I first set out to start the story.
It kind of expanded on its own organically.
Yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned the large cast of characters. One of the things that I particularly appreciate in the complete Berlin is in the back of the book, you do have a long list of the various characters, major and minor, that populate Berlin, and you even indicate which ones are actual historical figures and which are fictional. So I appreciate that. Now, coming back to my earlier question about how the project may have changed over time or from your original conception, one of the things I didn't have the opportunity to do is to fish out all of my issues of Berlin, and I did get all of the single issues.
Oh, bless you.
And actually, I guess you can say I've triple dipped because I have all of the individual issues. I have the first two books, the first two collections, City of Stone and then City of Smoke. And now this complete. So, again, it's a series, a title, a storyline that I absolutely love. So I have no problem with getting these various forms. But I haven't gone through and looked at the individual issues and to compare it to the completed Berlin. Are there any changes, like minor changes in art or story that you made along the way for this complete series?
I redrew, I think when we put out one of the editions of City of Stones, which is the first book of the trilogy, I redrew a number of pages at the very beginning, because I had gotten to be a better artist and I couldn't stand looking at those pages anymore. Which is that's just a recursive loop. If you're, cartoonists often feel that way, and you have to, I'm always telling my students, you just got to move on. And, there was just like maybe 4 pages I couldn't bear to look at. So I redrew those. And now when I look at those redrawn pages, I still have a hard time looking at them. Cause you always, you continue to improve and you can see the own faults in your work, with more distance that passes. And then beyond that, there were a number of relatively few, but, there were some factual errors that I, only learned about after, my German publisher, sort of vetted them and was going through the editing process over there and translating it. And they found some stuff that only, Germans intimate with the period could have spotted. And I made those corrections, but there's nothing in the story that changed, and there's no real serious dialogue changes. It was just corrections, to make things line up better with history.
Now, there are a number of, I guess, what you could call alternative comic serials that have lasted for 20 years or longer. And I'm thinking of something like, Love and Rockets immediately comes to mind. We had Hate until not too long ago, Optic Nerve. But the difference with those titles and your Berlin is that those creators were dealing with a variety of different characters who weren't necessarily connected, different storylines that many times didn't have one to do with the other. But with Berlin, I would think it would be a whole different kind of challenge in that you do have a larger story that you're telling. You're bringing in the various interactions of this ensemble cast. And so I'm curious about the challenges over the past 20-some years that you faced in continuing this story for as long as you did.
Yeah, there was that feeling from the very beginning. The initial impulse was to do 24 chapters of 24 pages each. So I knew that it was a finite canvas, that I was going to work within. And I enjoy working within constraints like that. It forces me to be more creative and to be aware of kind of the overall shape of the thing, so that as I get closer to the end, I need to start sort of bringing things towards that conclusion. And I think the only thing, somebody like Jaime or Gilbert, their stories, most of their stories occur within their respective worlds, with similar and overlapping casts of characters, and they can kind of tell any kind of story that they feel moved to tell within that context, and then all those fit into a larger whole, but it has more of the quality of like an ongoing television series or something like that. They've created these worlds, and then they can sort of do whatever they want within them according to their whim. And with Adrian's Optic Nerve, it's like a series of short stories, most of them unrelated. So he has he's kind of that, very, very different from the Hernandez brothers in that every issue is constrained, or every like 4 or 6 page story is constrained. And he's trying to create these tight little, well-oiled, pieces of comics. And I think my thing is somewhere in between that, where I was aware of the physical limitations, and having to have it all have an overall narrative shape, but within that pretty, it's a 500 and something pages. Within that, there's a lot of room to improvise. So that was a really interesting process to engage with it at that level.
Now, earlier you were saying that you took about 2 years to do research to set the groundwork, I guess, or to lay the groundwork for your narrative. What kind of research did you do?
Well, this was if the first issue came out in 96, I guess I probably started researching in 94. So I was still working on previous book at that point. And this is before the internet, really. I think maybe we were sending emails back and forth, but like there wasn't Google image search, and there wasn't a whole lot of stuff online to help you do historical research. So my routine was to I quit my day job and made a go of it as a starving artist, and I would spend I would spend a fair amount of time during the week haunting used bookstores around Seattle and going to various libraries and sort of finding everything I could about European history, before, pre 20th century European history, and then everything I could read about Germany. Anything I could lay my hands on that was related to this subject. Some of the most helpful stuff being like cruising the art section of a bookstore and finding like books about particular painters or other artists that were working at the time. German film in the period was really interesting. It was great to look at a lot of those things. I lost my thread.
No, you were talking about the historical research, your look at various art and art movements at the time.
Yeah. So that was like a super important part of the process. Oh, and the thing I was going to say was, the only limitation I set on myself there was I didn't want to read anything. I didn't want to read anything that kind of looked back with too much analysis of the time period, and I didn't want to read anything about or any kind of primary sources written after 1933, because I didn't want to bring too much of the kind of the baggage of established history back into this story of people who didn't know what the future held for them. I really wanted to put myself in the mindset of somebody living in Berlin in 1928, 1929, not knowing the future. Because one of the goals was to really put myself in the shoes of someone who's right there, like at the cusp of a pretty pivotal and dramatic point in history. What does the person on the street feel? What do they see? How do they react? What can they do? Is there anything to be done? That was one of the kind of personal goals. So in service of that, I tried not to read any material that would kind of influence that feeling too much.
So that leads me to your list of references and texts that served as inspiration. You have a pretty impressive list of, especially the non-fictional works, the various histories that you were just referring to. So you're saying that when you started this project, you tried to stay away from those historical accounts, and it was only later in the midst of the project that you visited those texts.
Yeah, and then I tried to pick and choose what I read within them. I just didn't want to read too much like analysis by historians about, after the fact. This happened, and clearly this other thing later was a repercussion of that. Like I wanted, and as a result, I tried not to have too much foreshadowing. Right, like I tried not to have too much. I mean, it's inevitable that like a very dark future was looming for them, and that the signs of that were present the same way that I, as a teenager in the 80s, was growing up during the Cold War with the threat of nuclear annihilation. Like I could totally relate to this feeling of like, well, some really bad stuff could happen, and that's going to affect your day-to-day existence. But yeah, as much as possible, I tried to avoid reading too much kind of historical analysis, and just tried to read just straightforward accounts of events.
And in fact, one of the texts that you have on there is Peter Gay's Weimar Culture, which I have a particular love for. So it really drew me your reference list. I remember reading that in college. I was taking a course in modern German history, and it was during that interwar period. And I really did enjoy that. And I became fascinated with the Weimar Republic and its history and culture after that course. But I'm wondering, what drew or draws you to this interwar period, the Weimar Republic, and the various art movements and excitement and sometimes even craziness, politically speaking, artistically speaking, that was going on at the time in Germany?
The initial feeling was purely unconscious, and I didn't actually know what drew me to it. It was just it was a decision to write a 600-page graphic novel about Weimar Berlin with really little reflection on what that meant. Like, I thought, and it'll take me, let's see, if I do this, it's this long, it'll take me 14 years. But the subject wasn't one I chose. That it felt random that I chose the subject, but I trusted my instinct. And later, I could see how that choice related not only to my own desire to understand that period in history, because I understood, there's a lot of information I had received about the Holocaust and World War II, but like that kind of really important period just before all hell broke loose was not something I knew much about. And so I realized later that I was just needed to learn. I really wanted to find out some stuff. But on top of that, I was living in Seattle in the 90s, which was a city that felt kind of full of potential. It was coming out of, was kind of gradually climbing out of a kind of low point in its, at least in its economic history. And all kinds of young people were flocking there. And, the grunge music scene was taking off. And this is like just before the internet boom, right? Which completely took over that whole area. Mm-hmm. So there was this feeling of like excitement, especially in the world of kind of, young artists trying to like figure out who they were as people and also like how they wanted to express themselves. There was a very kind of vibrant, exciting youth culture going on at the time. And I realized later that that excitement of being in a city around other kind of creative people who were trying new things, and that feeling of like anything could happen and there's, like all kinds of unrealized potential. And for me, working in comics alongside that was in the medium of comics at the time, I had come to an understanding that comics could be about anything, right? They didn't have to be genre driven. They didn't have to be superhero. In terms of subject, a comic could be anything. It's just a medium like any other, but there weren't a whole lot of examples of things outside of the usual genres. So, I was living in this city that was kind of like on the rise, surrounded by other creative people who were doing really interesting things. And then I was also engaged in this medium that I felt like had all this untapped potential. And I feel like now I recognize that Berlin at the time was a very similar kind of place. And that's one of the reasons I was drawn to it.
Mm. Well, obviously, as you're indicating, you have an interest in the art and the culture that was percolating at the time in Berlin. I find it interesting, though, that in going back through the completed Berlin now, and I didn't think this, I guess, initially when I first started reading years ago, Berlin, but you do touch upon certain artistic movements and cultural phenomena. Like, for instance, fairly early on when Marthe is enrolled in art school, we get some information about, the new objectivism?
Yeah.
And you mentioned expressionism here or there. But what really comes to the surface in terms of Berlin at the time is the politics, which you handle really well in showing the various factions and fracturedness of what was going on at the time with the Communist Party, with the National Socialists, the disappointment of the Social Democrats, and everything that was going on. In fact, a good bit of Berlin concerns this kind of political turmoil that, at least toward the beginning, is bubbling underneath the surface, but then becomes much more apparent and even visual as you progress in the narrative.
Yeah. I think part of it was just also that was part of my education. I discovered one of the surprising things I discovered was that there were something like 30 different political parties in the Reichstag, representatives of 30 different political parties, everything from, the Reich middle class party to the the agricultural party, like the Bavarian People's Party. Like they were all these various groups with representatives in parliament, and compared to the United States in the 90s, like I was just kind of totally surprised by that, and not knowing a whole lot about governments outside of our own. It was just partly an education in that as well. And so part of what I wanted to explore was that. What did that mean? How did that look on the street? How did people talk about it? So it was just an outgrowth of that investigation that I did there. And obviously, I wanted to understand if that was the political situation at the time. How was it that shifted into a nationalist? How did I learned that Hitler would make fun of the fact that there were that many political parties, because he would say, we are not, he would just laugh about it and say, it's ridiculous that there's this many different political parties. We're just one Germany, right? Mm-hmm. So he was able to actually use that to his advantage to take people's frustrations with that system and turn them into useful power.
Yeah. And obviously one of your main protagonists, Kurt, is concerned with the politics of the time, at times being almost obsessed with what's going on. But in the story itself, it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that Kurt and his relationship with politics is secondary to the other things that are going on with Kurt, including not only his work, but especially his relationship with Marthe, or the lack thereof, depending on where you are in the story. But with other characters, and I'm thinking in particular of Sylvia Braun, the politics is front and center when it comes to her story.
Yeah, because she's dealing with it face to face, right? Like Kurt is
literally in the streets.
Yeah, she's in the streets and she's dealing, like she's trying to survive, and she's trying to she's lost, she loses a family member and becomes kind of on her own. And I think I think that's an interesting contrast, because it's between, Kurt's a journalist who basically sits in his room, and for him politics to a certain degree are abstract. He's privileged and he is middle class, and he's able to kind of sit above it and look down and kind of critique what's going on, but not really have like a on the ground real experience with it. And that's one of the conflicts that he faces, is like, how do you, from a position of comfort, affect change? And for Sylvia, it's just a matter of life and death and survival. So it becomes really important. And she's influenced by the fact that her mom was at least dipping her toe in communism, while her dad is a National Socialist. So, I was interested in that contrast between the people for whom it's of vital and immediate importance, and the people who can kind of are able to hold it at arm's length and kind of discuss it from that perspective.
Yeah, talk about a fractured family. You have Gudrun Braun, who, as you put it, is dipping her toe, not maybe diving right in, but dipping her toe into the communist politics. And then her husband is a National Socialist, and they divide their children, at least in that first book, which leads me to this question. For those who have read Berlin, at least up to your first book, which I think came out in 2000, City of Stones, that first collection. Sure. I found it interesting that over the course of that first third of Berlin, a major character was Gudrun Braun, and we become close to her. We begin to empathize with her and her situation. But then, and I don't know if it's a spoiler. I don't want to get into spoiler territory, but something happens to her that is rather surprising. I mean, if that's all the story that you knew up to that point. But it seems to me that something like that was necessary in order to then later propel the narrative of her older daughter, Sylvia, because then she becomes, I think, even more central than her mother did in the last 2/3 of Berlin. Yeah,
absolutely. And that's all an outgrowth of the process I described of kind of putting my, winding up my characters and setting them loose on this stage and seeing what would happen. When Gudrun first appears in the story, she's just walking down the street in a rainstorm holding an umbrella. And I was doing this thing, or throughout the book, I do this thing where I kind of shift perspectives and show people's internal monologues and kind of drift across the various inhabitants of the city in a very kind of Wings of Desire way. And when I first introduced her, I had no idea that she would become an important character, much less that her daughter would become an important character. So it was like following one thread, seeing how it connects to another, and then kind of improvising from there. And then the dramatic event that happens in Gudrun's life, and that at the end of that first part, was something I didn't anticipate until pretty close to it. Like, it was a surprise to me that that's the way the story was going to go. And then when Sylvia rose, the focus shifted to Sylvia. And then at a certain point, so 12 years ago, we had our first child in real life, and my daughter. And I think sometime probably in the midpoint of this book is when that happened, and that affected the way that I felt about Sylvia. And she became somebody that I was particularly concerned about because, here I have a daughter myself, and I'm wanting her to grow up, safe and protected. And I want her to have like a hopeful future. So I think I paid Sylvia kind of rose to the top of the list in terms of my personal interest. And that's one of the reasons that I end up following her character more, is because of my own kind of personal feelings about a young girl or woman trying to make it in the world.
Yeah. And Sylvia, even though, what happens to her mother, it's almost as if she becomes an unanchored daughter. She's nonetheless a daughter in various ways in the last 2/3 of Berlin. And, her relationship with, I guess at first, Pavel.
Yeah.
And then later on with Otto.
Yeah.
And then even with the Schwartz family, especially David's mother, she is in many ways, I saw, a daughter to each of those individuals. So in many ways, it's not as if she's orphaned, but she just goes from one, if not a mother figure, then a father figure, one after another, trying to find her way and understand herself within those relationships.
Yeah. It's interesting when you put it that way, because it's pretty clear to me now that like, she kind of, she doesn't choose those relationships. They're kind of, they happen to her. And, luckily, because people are there to kind of look out for her and take care of her in one capacity or another. And I think for me, that was working through these steps of like, well, here are these different people caring about this person and wanting to do something, but for various reasons, there's only so far they can go, right? Like Pavel's a homeless guy who can care for her to a certain degree, and then he enough where he wants to get her set up at the Schwartz's house. And Otto is kind of a sort of mentor figure who knew her mom, so he cares for her, but he's also kind of imparting some of the communist ideals to her. And in the end, I feel like those three sets of surrogate parents kind of, she leaves them behind essentially, because she needs to be her own person and make those decisions for herself. And that's the kind of trajectory that she ended up on that I think she and Marthe, for me, both separately represent my kind of hopes for, my hopes for women in the world, like to kind of like be able to set out on their own and be their own people. And I did there, Sylvia's story could have been much grimmer, and realistically it could have easily been much grimmer if I wanted to go that direction. But I wanted her to have, in the end, a somewhat hopeful trajectory. So, and like I said, part of that was just out of a kind of hope for my own daughter.
Yeah, I mean, you made her tough. Is it any accident that both her mother's friend, who is a member of the KPD, and her father are both named Otto?
That was, initially that was an accident. Before when I first wrote the scene where the second Otto shows up, I just wrote that name down, and then I was like, oh wait, her dad's name is Otto. That's going to be confusing. And then I thought, well, but they're both like they're spelled the same frontwards and backwards, and I kind of liked that symmetry. And I also liked that on a certain level. I mean, I don't want to confuse the reader, but like I liked that they are on opposite. At the time, the two parties between which the most tension existed was the communists and the National Socialists. So I kind of liked that confusion and tension because they're kind of extremist in the way that those views manifested, and so I stuck with that at the risk of confusing readers because I liked the symmetry of it.
Now, did you know from the very beginning that in the series that you would mix fictional with historical figures?
Yeah, because the first one being Carl von Ossietzky, the editor of the Weltbühne, I read about him in this couple different books, and I was really struck by this guy who was just like Kurt in a position of privilege, who was kind of unstinting and fearless in his critique of what the German government was doing at the time. And I was really impressed by that. And I felt like I wanted, and I didn't know about this person before I started the book. So it was like one of those things that I discovered and was like, wow, this is really interesting. And I never even heard about this guy who did as much as he could to alter the course of history, right? Like he tried as much as possible to push Germany in a different direction that it ended up going. And so that was fascinating. And so I knew from the beginning that he was going to be in it and he was going to be Kurt's editor. And then very early on, Joachim Ringelnatz, who is a poet and performer who really existed. I just really liked the way he looked, and I liked his he has a very kind of, at least what I've read about him, he had a very kind of funny, antic kind of personality, and I wanted to bring a little humor in through him. So I chose those two guys, and then past that, I knew there were probably going to be other historical figures showing up, but I wasn't sure who. And for the longest time, I thought I wanted to avoid putting Hitler in there. Like I just didn't want to give him the screen time, so to speak. I wanted to have the story be about things other than him and about what was happening, to have him be kind of like a presence, but not an actual character. But then at a certain point, after I introduced Goebbels, which I had to do because Goebbels was the kind of district commander for Berlin, and if there's going to be rallies and whatnot in the city, then he's going to be there. At a certain point, I realized that I couldn't. Hitler was like the elephant in the room, and I instead of allowing him to have that much power by not being present, I decided to incorporate him into it. But I think I was about halfway through before I got to that point where I could do that.
Yeah, we don't see Hitler until later in the storyline, or even Goebbels for that matter. I mean, we see more of Goebbels than Hitler, but it wasn't until later in your narrative that we're introduced to Goebbels. And not only are there, I guess, political historical figures in the text, but there are others as well. I appreciated you bringing in Josephine Baker for that brief period.
Yeah. There's a great temptation when you're writing historical fiction about a very rich place where you're like, oh, that person was there. I gotta shoehorn that person in somehow. And I tried as much as possible to avoid that. But the reason I decided to include her is that I wanted the Cocoa Kids to be like, I wanted a show of successful African American in that context, and show that the Cocoa Kids could kind of like, who were huge fans of hers, to admire her success and kind of like see it as a possible future for themselves, to have this kind of almost a role model for them. And also just to have, I tried to write that scene to have it be somewhat humorous. So I was always looking for ways to bring in some kind of lightness because the grim facts of what awaited all these people. I didn't want the whole book to kind of drown in that foreboding. So that was an opportunity where I could do that. And I knew that she was, in Berlin. She at least passed through Berlin on a number of occasions around then. So that was, it was an opportunity that presented itself, and I decided to go with it.
Yeah, I particularly appreciated that because not too long ago we discussed Jose Louis Bouquet and Marthe Müller's graphic novel biography, Josephine Baker. And so I was glad that you brought her in. But you brought her in, interestingly enough, and you mentioned their group's name, the Cocoa Kids. I think we're introduced to the Cocoa Kids the beginning of the second part of Berlin.
Yeah.
What started with City of Smoke. And coming back to your original intentions, is this something that just occurred to you later, or did you know at some point that you would want to bring in a group of African-American jazz musicians into your story?
I was maybe 3/4 of the way through part one. And one of the things I discovered in my research was this poster for a band called the Chocolate Kitties.
Oh, God.
Which, it is just as like, and the poster of the Cocoa Kids that shows up in the story is the same level of kind of racist caricature that I saw on this poster, and I was completely appalled by this poster. I mean, not appalled in the sense like I wasn't surprised, but like, oh my God, like I can't believe like this is how they would have advertised a band. And I thought, well, what about those guys in that poster? What about those people? Like, what was their life like, and how do you negotiate a career, or how do you negotiate the world if this is how the world sees you? I was really interested in that idea, and also I didn't want to have the story just be about white people. Mm-hmm. So I tackle narratives in terms of units, like whether it's a chapter or a page or a panel, like it's all about these units and how you kind of arrange them and kind of engineer them. And I was coming to the end of that first set of 8 chapters, and I had this poster was in my head, and I was going to go into this next part. The first part concludes, and then you're sort of starting. There's kind of a clean wipe, and then you start the second act, so to speak. And I wanted a kind of framing device that would recontextualize the city. So bringing in these Americans was one way to do that, and I wanted to use them. I wanted to explore what the life of a touring jazz band might have been like, and in a environment that was very much like a white nationalist environment. So that was the initial impulse, and then the mandate for me was like, when I look at this poster of these guys, they're just all the same stereotypical, exaggerated, cartoony drawing. Who are they as individuals? And then I sort of got down to like, I want each one of these members of this band to really be a person, to be a real individual with their own. I developed kind of backgrounds for all of them, and I have like, you figured out where they're from and what they did previously and how they ended up in this band. And then just after doing all that work, kind of just like everybody else, kind of set them loose on the stage to see what would happen.
Yeah, and I appreciated the fact that you used the band Cocoa Kids in a variety of different ways, because what, for instance, Kid Hogan goes through is very different from what we see with, Johnny Delacroix?
Yeah.
And albeit briefly with I guess Johnny, but again, you use the individual members of the band in different ways without maybe spending a lot of time exploring the further ramifications of whatever it is that they're going through. I think the most that you spend with any of those characters is with Kid Hogan, right? And his relationship with, is her name Gerda?
Pola.
Oh, Pola. Oh, yeah. That's right. Pola. Yeah, Gerda's someone else. So you really bring that in. And I was kind of surprised that the Cocoa Kids became central beginning in what eventually became Book 2, City of Smoke. It's like, where'd these people come from? Or now, a third of the way in, we're being introduced to new guys.
Yeah, I'm definitely breaking some classic narrative rules there to wait till that point to bring in a whole new. It's not just a new character; it's like 5 new characters.
Yeah, but your protagonist, I guess your central protagonist throughout, would be Kurt and Marthe and their relationship. And one of the things I found interesting about both of those characters is in many ways they're artist figures. Now, obviously, Marthe comes across as an artist figure because she's someone we see in art school at the very beginning, and she has at times a complicated relationship with art, but she's definitely there's an artist inside. Kurt maybe is more of a critic, but the fact that he is a writer, that still strikes me as somewhat of an artist figure. So that leads me to this question. Anytime a writer, a creator, an artist brings front and center in terms of the protagonist, an artist figure, you wonder, is the creator saying something about herself or himself with these protagonists? So I ask you, is there anything that's going on in your narrative with Kurt and Marthe and their relationship that is the artist in you coming out?
Before I drew the first page of the story, I made kind of lists of things I wanted to explore with comics. Like I mentioned before, I thought the potential of comics, there was still so much kind of unexplored and untapped, and I really wanted to do that. So it was lists of aspects of human experience and human nature. There was a list of the five senses, and how do you show smell or touch in comics. I wanted to explore all those aspects, and when I was thinking about my two main characters, I thought about them initially in this kind of highbrow, metaphorical way of, I'm going to have an artist who's a woman and a writer who's a man, one of whom expresses themselves in pictures and the other of whom expresses themselves in words, those are the constituent components of comics. I wanted to, and the idea was I'm going to put them together and they're going to have a relationship, and it's going to be in part, on some level, the relationship between words and pictures, just like comics. So I'm actually exploring that language as I make the comic, and then through my characters, I was going to be on some metaphorical level exploring that as well. So that was the initial idea, which is a very detached, right? That wasn't about the characters. That was me making a kind of narrative meta decision. So that's very much in the kind of overarching sense about my interests and who I am as an artist. But thankfully, that pretense kind of dropped away, and they eventually just became themselves. They became characters, and they weren't mouthpieces for that idea anymore, which I was grateful for, because that would have been kind of unbearable if I completely followed through on that. I mean, there's some resonance there. It's still about that, and they still talk about what words and images mean to them, and that is there to some degree, but I truly tried to pay attention to them as individuals and figure out who they were on their own terms. That being said, every character in the whole book is some aspect of me reflected on the page, and I try as much as possible to get outside of myself and see the world from other people's perspectives. But in the end, it's all ultimately, the ultimate filter is my own view. So a lot of people do say things. For some people, it's very easy to draw upon my own thoughts and feelings to express stuff. And Kurt and Marthe are probably the two most the two characters who are the most like mouthpieces for me. Like everything that they say is like, Kurt's a little heavy-handed and kind of overly dramatic in his, maybe not overly dramatic given what's at stake, but he's very kind of doom and gloom.
Very cynical.
Very cynical, very potentially depressed, and very much reflects my own worst tendencies when it comes to thinking about, dark futures, all through ever since the 80s, like I was describing about the threat of nuclear annihilation, like this feeling that, or like Y2K, I don't know if you remember the whole Y2K scare, where we all thought the computers' worlds were going to reset and accidental nuclear war would happen. That kind of sense of like a kind of looming catastrophe has always been with me, and he becomes a kind of avatar for that feeling. And then Marthe is this other side of me, which is a more sanguine, relaxed, to like just be in the world, just like be in the moment. The thing that she struggles with that I don't relate to as much is she really struggles with who she is and what her identity is. And that came out of trying to understand what life for a young woman would be like in Berlin in the 1920s, when the traditional roles for women have kind of been, they've been broken up a little bit, and other possibilities exist. Like women could actually start to have careers and stuff for the first time. So I was trying to figure out who she was in that context, and how difficult and confusing that would be to try to like find a path when no path had been carved out for you or shown to you. But yeah, generally speaking, they do in different ways reflect pretty directly a lot of my own thoughts.
Well, what about Marthe's problematic or complicated relationship with art and seeing herself as an artist? Is that some of your struggles coming out through that character?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've always known from a very early age, I knew I wanted to make comics, and I haven't really had much hesitation about making art because I think my mom raised me in an environment where that was encouraged, and it was okay. It was okay to draw. It was okay to make things, and ultimately it was okay for me to try this career where I was going to potentially really have to struggle. Making a living at comics is difficult, to say the least. And I was fortunate enough to have a mom who supported that, even though it filled her with anxiety. So that I don't share with Marthe. I think I never have had much doubt about what I wanted to do. There were times when I sort of gave up comics because I was frustrated with one aspect or another of either the subculture or the marketplace, and thought I was going to be, more of a fine artist of some kind. I don't know what. But I never had any doubt about the need and the importance for me personally to make art. So that part of her personality is not reflective of me. That was more me trying to see the world through the eyes of this character as opposed to my own.
Mm. Another thing that came up in Berlin, and we don't see reference to him, but just a couple or a few times, and this is through the character of David Schwartz, because David has a poster and he's fascinated by Houdini.
Yeah.
And those familiar with your work know that there's something about the Great Escape Artist that seems to have your attention. I mean, obviously in Jar of Fools, we have Ernie and Floso, who are escape artists themselves. And then, the book you did with Nick Bertozzi is several years ago, all about Houdini.
Yeah.
And then we get a Houdini slight, albeit reference, in the long Berlin storyline. I guess this is a two-part question. Is there something about either Houdini individual or an escape artist in general that really captures your imagination? And then along with that, would you call Berlin a narrative in some ways of escape?
Yeah, Houdini, I discovered Houdini when I was in art school. A friend of mine, I mean, I'd heard the name, but I didn't really know much about him. And that friend of mine was really into him and sort of got me turned on to him. And I read a couple of different biographies. And I think the thing that I found so fascinating about him was how, I mean, it's a lot of things, but he was incredibly disciplined, incredibly knowledgeable, incredibly master showman and master marketer. He had to kind of handle all these different aspects to build this career for himself. And on top of that, he was Jewish. He was a Jew in the early 20th century who could get 30,000 people to show up in Boston to watch him jump off a bridge. That to me is pretty remarkable. And then the fact that he could be put to all appearances, anything you tried to do to entrap him or imprison him, he could undo. Right. So nothing could hold him. And I just appreciate that on a lot of levels. I appreciate that on the purely physical level of the fact that, like, if you try to, enclose me in physical bonds, I will just slip out. You cannot hold me down. Just so in terms of like basic human spirit, but then especially in the hands of an oppressed or marginalized group, I think that's really powerful and really. I mean, he was a real life superhero in a lot of ways. Complicated human being, could be a total jerk. Everybody's complicated, but there's a lot to admire about him, and he's completely fascinating. And so I think that initial introduction to him, and there was a period of fascination. He just became part of my personal, lexicon in terms of when I want to talk about things of a certain nature. So, and David, being Jewish and growing up at the time and being aware of this character, aware of this person, it just made sense for those two to go together. And then, in the bigger sense, I knew very early on that I wanted David to escape. Like, I wanted his family to get out, and Houdini just represents that. There's a moment near the end when David has to help with he's studied lockpicking because he's a big fan of Houdini, and he has to help some of his friends with his lockpicking skills. And so there's a moment where he looks at the poster of Houdini, and that's when he sort of makes a decision. And also the decision, the kind of the desire to just get out from under this kind of increasingly oppressive force that was closing in. And so that I think Houdini just represents the kind of ability to escape. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And, getting back to this question of Berlin being a narrative of escape, you mentioned David and his family, the Schwartz's decision to leave Berlin, and we see them doing that at the end. But, there are also other characters in certain situations that escape in one form or another. I mean, there is, we were talking earlier about the Cocoa Kids and what they do with their, I guess, German handler. What's his name?
Schnitzy.
Schnitzy. That's right. With Schnitzy, great German name, is in many ways an escape. And then, of course, there's Kid Hogan, and what happens with him is a form of escape as well. But even a character like Kurt, who, remains in Berlin. And again, one of the things I really enjoyed about the completed Berlin is the fact that there is, with certain characters, quite a bit of ambiguity. In other words, we don't know what happens to them. A good example of that is Pavel. When he jumps that train, what happens to him? We don't know. Who knows? Same thing with Kurt. Now, you could argue that he's trapped there given who he is and the kind of things that he does, his occupation. On the other hand, he experienced a form of escape in the last third of the narrative with, and what was his name? You mentioned him earlier. Joachim, yes, the clownish figure who, metaphorically pulls him out of the bottle.
Yeah.
And that's a form of escape. And then we have your other protagonist, Marthe, and what she does at the very end of Berlin is, I don't know, I think it's maybe an arguable escape, because on the one hand, it is getting out or getting away from something, but at the same time, she's going back to something that may or may not work for her. So again, we have that ambiguity.
Yeah, she's kind of entrapped by her personal history, but internally she is walking away from that, I guess. Yeah, but you're right. It is totally that combination. And I never thought about, it's funny, all this stuff is in there, and I'm not particularly conscious of the themes that I'm bringing up, but you've just clearly enumerated the fact that getting away from things is a big part of this story. I mean, a lot of times it's like, sometimes the narrative beat is, when you close a scene or a chapter or an act on somebody leaving, it's kind of a natural. There's like a rhythm that happens, and there's there's like a natural tendency to, it's the classic riding off into the sunset on a horse, right, at the end of a Western. There's this feeling of moving on to the next thing. And I think embedded in that for me is that sense of like possibility, where you don't know where that person's going to end up, but you can kind of imagine it. And I think there's always this feeling of like, what's the potential future, right? When Kid Hogan and Pola get on a plane and leave for Paris, like, wow, imagine what that life could be like for them. It could be really great. I mean, who knows? And I think that feeling of what, the unwritten story of what lies ahead is completely interesting to me.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned Pola and Kid Hogan flying off to Paris in a plane, and they even make, a comment about flying and, the uncertainty of that. I don't know. To me, one of the things that just has always struck me is that the train stands as kind of a life-changing means of transportation in ways that buses, cars, and planes don't. In other words, I've always associated trains with going someplace else, starting over, or starting a new life, or getting away from something. And that brings me to Marthe. And again, without going into too much detail about what happens in the end, I think I can say that we see at the very beginning and at the very end of Berlin, Marthe front and center, and Marthe in a train that becomes significant. So again, coming back to this earlier question about your original intentions, did you know that you would frame your narrative in such a conscious, symbolic way?
No, I didn't. I didn't really. I think I had probably 6 or 7 different endings that I was working through. 3/4 of the way through the book, at that point, I had 6 or 7 different possible endings, and it took me a while to arrive at the one that felt most right out of those. It may not have been the ultimately perfect ending. I mean, who knows? But like, out of all the ones I had that had presented themselves, it was the one that I ended up at. And like that kind of opening and closing framing device can be helpful in terms of just lending your story a sense of like closure or completion. But I also thought a lot about, like you mentioned, the train is like that sense of like you're going somewhere and who knows what lies ahead. But also the train is, compared to things like an airplane or a car, it's just goes on the one track, right? Like it always goes forward. It never goes. It can reverse, but when you're on a train, you're going forward and you're going to wherever that track takes you. Like it's and in the beginning, she's coming into her destination is Berlin, clearly. So that's why she's on the train. And at the end, I think one of the things I was trying to do was like, it's kind of a trap because you're stuck on that track, right? So that the thing I was exploring there was like her future, her personal future has been written by her family and tradition, like what she's supposed to do as a young woman in Germany, according to tradition. And so the train can kind of reflect that by being this kind of inevitable, it's just going to go down that one track back home. And then at various points in the story, it shows up, Hitler comes in on the train. And Kurt has kind of a nightmare where he is between 2 train tracks as 2 trains kind of barrel
that's right.
past.
Yeah.
And to me, on some level, again, not super consciously, and it's only upon reflection that I see this now, I think that to me represented this kind of irresistible, kind of unavoidable momentum towards a definite future, which is the kind of foreboding quality, right? Is there any way to avoid what's about to happen next? Well, when you're on a train, no.
Yeah. And also, let's not forget, since you're talking about Germany in the 1930s, what trains meant for the Jewish population later on.
Right. Yeah. That was always in my head as well.
Okay, so over the past 20-some years, have you were telling me earlier about your research and your growing fascination with what was going on in terms of Weimar culture at the time. What about the city of Berlin? Did you find yourself drawn closer and closer to this capital city as you were writing Berlin?
Yeah. I mean, I really, pretty early on, I found an old Pharaoh's plan from 1928, like a detailed map of the city. And I I would I'd find photos in books and photocopy, and then I'd pin them up on a wall with like a thread pointing to the part of the city that photo was of. And the more I really did try to like put myself there, and ultimately it's just an imaginary version of the city, because of course the city got pretty much leveled during the war, and the real city today, my city pales in comparison to the real city, but I did find myself more and more drawn into the place, and the more details that I discovered, the more I was able to kind of live there for a little while, I guess. I have my favorite way to spend my free time is playing tabletop role-playing games, and that goes back to the late 70s. And I think that mentality of creating an imagined space and trying to inhabit it is really enjoyable for me. Like it's a really fun, engaging activity. So I think in some ways I approached the story in that same way, as a kind of world building based on history and facts, but creating a space in my head that I could engage with and really enjoy exploring was part of the goal.
And one of the reasons why I ask about your relationship with Berlin is those 4 2-page spreads at the very end of your narrative.
Yeah.
There's one of Berlin bombed out and decimated at the end of the war. Then we get a 2-page spread of what Berlin looked like during the Cold War, when you had the city divided into East and West. And then we have another 2-page spread with actually some color on the wall itself after the wall began to come down. And then we have a photograph of modern, I'm assuming, Berlin, again, a 2-page spread. And so that really struck me. I wondered, though, and I wanted to ask you, as the creator of Berlin, this question. I had thought initially that your narrative, Berlin proper, ended with Marthe getting off the train, and she says at one point in that last panel, I imagine turning back toward the city. And then you turn the page and you get those 4 2-page spreads. So originally I thought, okay, well, the narrative ends there. And then we get these 4 2-page spreads, which are not necessarily afterthoughts, but expressions of the changes that Berlin went through. Then I started to second guess myself and say, well, maybe those 4 2-page spreads are actually part of the story, given that the title of your narrative is Berlin, that Berlin itself becomes a main character, and we see not only the changes that characters like Kurt and Marthe go through, but that the city goes through.
Yeah, I think that's true. And it's definitely part of the story. They're not that combination of her having that thought and then turning the page and that image, that was super important. And they were from the very initial thought, those were joined, like that she would imagine going back, and that you would turn that page and you would jump forward suddenly in time. It's absolutely essential to the rest of the narrative. And yeah, that's a good point. In those spreads, there's no people until the photograph. So all of a sudden you are faced with just the architecture of the city changing through time. And I was definitely trying to, it's not like a specific thing, it's like one of those things where you have this image in your head, or this series of images, and it gives you a feeling, and you want to capture that feeling or convey that feeling. So it's not like I can necessarily articulate, and I don't want to articulate the specific thing I was going for, because I think words don't really do it. But that conception of her leaving the city, thinking about turning around, and then jumping forward in time to show the city through different periods was definitely super important to me. Like, it's kind of that is the ending.
Okay.
And it arose out of all of the previous pages and what the experience of writing the whole book had meant to me. Like all of that stuff inside of me that was percolating, like those images just arose up kind of unbidden, and I had to like put them down, because that's the feeling that I wanted. I wanted to be sudden and dramatic, and also to push the reader away. And after hopefully having the reader in pretty close, I wanted to like suddenly pull back and show the bigger picture and give the reader a different sense of that environment that all the characters had been living in.
Now, you've been teaching at the Center for Cartoon Studies for 10 years now, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's roughly about half the time, maybe a little less, that you were in the process of creating Berlin. I'm wondering if you can tell me about how your role as, a professor of art at the Center for Cartoon Studies, of working with younger artists, of mentoring, has not only informed your work on the Berlin series, but your comics as a whole.
Well, the main thing it does is it gives me like regular contact with other artists who are all engaged with this medium and are all excited about it and all trying to figure out what they want to say and how they want to say it, which is my own struggle as well. And that is really energizing to be able to walk into a classroom and to talk about comics and with a passionate and disciplined group of students who are super excited about the medium. So mainly, a lot of what I've done in the past 20 years is work in my basement or some small room equivalent as I have tried to get these pages done. And it's a very isolated kind of existence. I mean, I have a family and I have a personal life, but when I'm in my studio, it's a pretty isolated kind of thing. So one of the huge things that teaching at the school has given me is this contact with a community. And I guess most importantly, it's a group of students who I get to try to my job is to help them figure out how to say what they want to say, to help them find their individual voices. And it's just it is really energizing. And so that when I go back to my own drawing table, I can be even more excited about, whatever I'm going to be working on.
Mm. Well, speaking of things that you're working on, and I know that we've just gotten the complete Berlin. It's out of the way. You talked earlier about kind of the weight being lifted off of you. But I have to ask you, what other project or projects are you working on right now that you can share with us?
I had a lot of time to think about it. I've had 20 years to develop ideas, and I've got a notebook full of them. But the current plan is to do 3 96-page graphic novels. Each one would be completely self-contained. And I'm drawing smaller. I'm drawing more efficiently. I'll be able to get pages done at a more rapid rate. And the sort of current time frame is to spend basically 2 years on each of these books. They're going to be genre stories. So they're going to be so Berlin is a very kind of sprawling, rambling, novelistic approach to a story. And I want to tackle genre tales in a kind of more straightforward. I want to explore kind of traditional 3-act formula and see what I can do with it. And the first one that I know, I know what they're all going to, at this point, I know what each of the 3 books is about, but this first one, which I'm relatively, it's developed, is a Western that takes place in Arizona in 1865. So it's the tail end of the Civil War. It's basically desert, which is the opposite of an urban environment. It's still historical, but it's going to be sort of an action adventure, but from the perspective of characters that Westerns are not usually about. So it's not about the marshal or the outlaw. It's about, the main character is a 16-year-old Mexican girl, and indigenous people figure prominently in the storyline. And one of my challenges is to figure out how to write these characters and engage with their world and present them in a kind of thoughtful, respectful, and considerate way. So I'm consulting with people to make sure that happens, and I'm not just another white guy appropriating somebody's story. But I'm really interested in exploring this time period. Really, I guess I am always drawn to these areas of potential, and I feel the frontier, this is just before Arizona becomes a territory. So all kinds of possibilities exist. There's all these different cultural influences. There's Spanish and Mexican. There's Anglo stuff coming in from the East. And there's all the people that have been living there for thousands of years. So that's a very interesting kind of, in some ways tragic, in some ways totally incredible kind of environment. So that's the general context for the next book.
So, I was thinking, given the ensemble cast of Berlin, and as you put it, kind of its sprawling nature, so if we see the completed Berlin as something akin to your War and Peace, then perhaps, without getting too grandiose here, then perhaps these other books that you're working on or you're thinking about, those three a little more genre-based self-contained narratives would be something more in line with, let's say, Family Happiness or The Death of Ivan Ilyich.
Yeah, the comparison is humbling, but yeah, I think that's fair. I've only got this one big crazy epic in me, and it's done. And so now it's time to have a little more fun, and also really I just want to engage with different subjects and figure out what comics can do in other ways. So.
Well, Jason, I want to thank you again for coming on the Comics Alternative and talking not only about your completed Berlin, but also your work in a larger sense.
Thanks, Derek. It's been a pleasure. Thanks a lot for having me on the podcast.
Thanks again to Jason Lutes for talking with me about Berlin. Both the single-volume collection and the third volume in the series, City of Light, were just released by Drawn Quarterly. If you've never before picked up an issue of Berlin, then you're in for a treat. Go out and get your copy of Berlin and read the series in its entirety. And if you want to find Jason's books at great prices, then head on over to the website of our sponsor, Discount Comic Book Service. As I mentioned at the top of the show, if you go to DCB Service right now, you'll find the complete Berlin at 30% off of the cover price. And you can get the same kind of discount on his previous book, Jar of Fools. That's dcbservice.com. And after you do get your titles there, get in touch with me and let me know what you thought about my interview with Jason Lutes. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up your phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427. You can also email us. We're 2guys@comicsalternative.com, or you can contact me directly. I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com. And you can find us all over social media. We have accounts on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, Slack, and Discord. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcasts. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on Spotify, on Google Podcasts, on TuneIn, and on iHeartRadio. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on the blog, simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com. We have more interviews lined up in the days to come, so be sure to check back for those. Until then, take care.